All right, good evening, and welcome to the City Council Study Session of Tuesday, April 16th, 2024. One item on the agenda, discussion regarding the proposed FYE 2025 City of Norman budget, general fund discussion, and special revenue funds. Mr. Francisco.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Good evening, members of council. It is my privilege to start to introduce the fiscal year 2024-2025 budget to you. This is the city manager's proposed budget as we'll be going forward in a series of study sessions. I'd first like to thank everyone who has given input into this process over the last several months, but especially to Kim Kaufman, our budget manager, who has done the majority of the work to get us to this point. So she deserves all the credit. Absolutely. And as usual, she deserves all the blame for anything that you find that's wrong. So as you're reading through the documents, give us a call or an email if you see any typographical errors or anything like that, and we'll get them corrected. The budget document is the most comprehensive document that the city puts out, at least in my opinion. And it is several things in one. It is a financial plan, which is what people think about first. And it is a plan going forward. And I would say that that is the difference between the budget document and the financial reports that you get at the end of the fiscal year, is that the budget is a looking forward plan of what we expect to happen over the next fiscal year. The financial reports are a looking back document on what has happened. But the budget is also a policy document, and all of the financial policies of the city are stated. All the laws that we have to comply with are restated in there. It is an operations guide. It talks about all of the operations of the city. We'll talk about that, but everything that the city does is encapsulated in those detailed budget documents as you go forward in the device. Everything that is in the budget is a public document. So if the public is requiring to review the budget document, it will be available online. It will be available in print. I guess I used to say at the library, but I will say at the West Side or the East Side branch libraries. It will be available in print, or you can pick up a copy in print from our offices. This is the city manager's proposed budget, so think of this as the executive budget being presented to you, the legislative branch. As you see, we have been during the budget process for many months now. We started the process with the capital budget study session back in November. At each of the finance committee meetings that we've had monthly, there have been discussions of the budget and input given to the budget document that has gotten us to this point. We did the mid-year budget review in January. Council gave us this direction at that point. You wanted to kind of stay steady state as related to the net revenue stabilization fund and the rainy day fund. You didn't want to make an additional deposit there. We had another capital budget study session in February. And now at this point in the process where we have prepared the city manager's document, it will be prepared, it will be presented first in this study session tonight, which you see highlighted there in blue. A second study session that will be held on May the 7th, and a third study session for the enterprise funds on May 21st. There will be a public budget hearing at your next council meeting on April the 23rd. That again is a chance for the public to give input into the public budget process formally. There'll be a second public budget hearing on May the 28th, and then council will consider the budget for adoption on June the 11th. As you're reviewing the document, you can think of it as going from the most summarized to the most detailed. I know most of you have heard this information before, but I know that we have some newly elected council members and some members of the public who might be viewing on YouTube who are not familiar with the kind of the layout of the budget document. So just think of the format being from the most summarized to the most detailed as you go from left to right, as you go from page 1 to page 480. If you don't read anything else, I would strongly urge you to read the city manager's letter. that is on pages Roman 1 through 14. And I would strongly urge you to concentrate on the financial summary sections that are on pages 55 through 120. There's also some very useful information on the community as a whole that's given in the community profile section on pages 1 through 9. There are benchmark comparisons that compare Norman to cities of similar size and characteristics. A lot of times we get questions about that, and we will just copy those pages and refer them to you. How many employees per capita do we have in Norman compared to Broken Arrow or Edmond or Lawrence, Kansas? Those sorts of things are in there and available for you to see. The financial policies that we talked about are given on pages 34 through 54. That includes all of the policies that council readopts when you readopt the budget. It also includes the verbatim copy of the Oklahoma Municipal Budget Act. And then the detail sections on every division and department of the city are given on pages 121 through 457. They're kind of given alphabetically. So if what you're interested in is the planning department, just thumb through the P and you'll find planning and community development, and everything that all the divisions of the planning department will be given in their section. It'll give you a mission statement for that department. It'll give you an org chart for every department in the city. It's all there for you. This gives you a layout of all of the city's 29 different funds that are in place and the sort of funds that they are. So the general fund is the largest single fund of the city, and all of the operating departments that are not in enterprise funds are in the general fund, so they're laid out there in the red. The special revenue funds, which again we'll be talking about both of those tonight, are given in the blue there. See that there's a new YFAC fund, Young Family Athletic Center Fund, that is a special revenue fund. The enterprise funds of the city are established to operate like separate sub-businesses of the city. You should think of the city as kind of a business conglomerate, just as Google owns YouTube, okay? The city owns a water business, and that's two separate businesses. There is a separate and distinct set of customers for the water enterprise or the wastewater enterprise that is separate from the city as a whole. And the users of those services, of the enterprises, pay for the full cost of providing those services, separate and apart from the general fund. They don't get any tax money, that sort of thing. So that is the difference between the enterprise operations of the city and the general governmental operations of the city. There are internal service funds where, for example, the risk management function charges out to the departments for all of the services that are being provided through risk management, health insurance claims, tort claims against the city that are being paid out, that those are being charged to every department of the city internally through those internal service charges to pay for those risk management funds and those internal service funds. In the third study session, we will talk about the capital funds of the city. The capital funds of the city account for those longer-lived assets of the city, like buildings, or bridges, or streets. Those sorts of things are accounted for in the capital funds. And then finally are the general debt service and GO bond funds of the city. There is a separate section of the budget document that will show you every outstanding debt issuance that the city has, whether they be general obligation bonds or whether they be revenue bonds that are backed by the Norman Municipal Authority or the Norman Utility Authority. And again, the difference being the general obligation bonds are repaid through a property tax that the voters have approved. Revenue bonds are backed by just the utility revenues that are pledged for the repayment of those utility revenue bonds, or a sales tax revenue bond like we have for the Norman Forward bonds, just a special source of revenue that is singularly pledged to repay those debts. Here are some highlights of those financial policies that you should be aware of. The budget is required to be adopted by the city charter. You have to adopt a budget. That budget has to be balanced. And when we say balanced, that means that each of those individual 29 or 30 funds of the city has to have a positive fund balance. Positive fund balance means that you either have money in the savings account, which is what I'm calling the fund balance, or you have revenues projected to come in excess of the expenditures that you're going to have in the coming fiscal year. And there has been some misunderstanding about that. You can adopt a budget that spends more money than you take in any given fiscal year, as long as you have fund balance to draw on. State law requires that there be a public budget hearing held at least 15 days in advance. And as you know, the council has directed that we have a second public budget hearing. So that one that we will have at the next council meeting is in addition to the state law mandated public budget hearing. Once the budget has been adopted, it has to be certified by the county excise board. County Excise Board has gotten some publicity lately, but they do in fact have to receive our budget document. They review it and say whether our assumptions are reasonable, and they can disallow it. They don't have to certify it, but they have always certified that our assumptions in the budget are reasonable. After the budget is adopted, after the fiscal year has begun, the budget has to be transmitted to the state auditor, to various bond trustees, and to the Municipal Securities Rulemaking Board, and that is by covenants of all of those debt service holders that we have. The budget then, by law, has to be available in print and electronically, and we have always met all of those requirements, and we will so this year. When the council adopts the budget, you re-adopt all of those financial policies that are stated in the budget document. So if you wanted to change any of those policies, now would be the time to do it. When you adopt the budget, you appropriate, and again, appropriation means taking money out of the fund balance and allocating it to expenditure accounts. And again, that is the important duty that council gives as it relates to the budget. Only council, only the elected body can appropriate fund balance. Once you have appropriated the fund balance, you've done what I call taking money out of the savings account and putting it into the checking account. You have control of the savings account, and only you have control of the savings account. Once you appropriate money out of the savings account and put it into the checking account, and the checking account is these hundreds of individual line items that money gets allocated to, now that is under the purview of the city manager, okay? The budget document includes 5-year forecasts of where we think we will be if we continue on the same course that we are on over the next 5 years. You have operating, capital, and debt reserve policies that are restated in the budget document. The levelized utility rate policy that we state that over the next 5 years, we make sure that we want to have utility rates that are at least positive. You have policies for transfers from the utilities to the general fund to account for what private utility would pay for to operate in the public rights of way. Chris especially likes that. And there's a transfer from the room tax fund to the general fund to account for the services that the city's administration is providing to the room tax providers. The council has adopted an ordinance, 1011-58, which is called the Net Revenue Stabilization Fund. These are the reserve policies of the city that are that we must comply with, are being run afoul of that ordinance. So basically, the Net Revenue Stabilization or Rainy Day Fund policy says that we must have a minimum of 3% of operating reserves in the general fund, not appropriated, but held in reserve. We must have an appropriated 1% general fund emergency reserve that we hope we will not have to spend, but we have to allocate money for that 1% reserve. And as we've talked about, this particular year, we have had to draw on that 1% reserve to remediate the mold problem that we had at the Central Library. Unusual circumstance, but that's what that emergency fund is for. we must have at least a 4% reserve in the separate net revenue stabilization fund. And there are strings attached before council can appropriate money out of that rainy day fund. They're stated here. But there has to be a federally declared disaster or a state declared disaster before you can appropriate money out of the rainy day fund. You would have had to have spent down that 1% reserve. The operating reserve would have had to have been drawn down below 1% before you can appropriate money out of the rainy day fund. And I'm very proud to say that council has never appropriated any money out of the rainy day fund in its, 12 years of existence. That's much to your credit. We've had a lot of emergencies in that time. We've always been able to operate them and handle them within appropriations that we have done in the various operating funds. This year, we're projecting that the rainy day fund will meet its minimum reserve levels that you see there. You'll be about $494,000 short of the targeted 5% reserve. But again, council directed that we kind of stay steady, that we kind of steady as she goes as relates to the rainy day fund in this fiscal year. Moving then into the budget for the coming year, and that's kind of the overriding theme, steady as she goes, if you will, if we talked about it. We're not adding a whole lot of things like we did last year. We're not drawing down fund balances and that sort of thing for one-time capital purchases like you prudently did last year. But we're also not cutting a lot of things. So it's a kind of an overall thing of finishing what we started, those projects we have ongoing, the bond issue related projects, the Norman Forward projects, all of those things, we're going to continue with those, but we're not adding a whole lot. In so doing, we have a total budget this fiscal year of $307,477,000. And that sounds like a lot. It is a lot. It's a lot to manage. But for a city our size, that's a pretty lean and mean budget, a pretty small budget. You see that where the money is going to are those areas that you would think. Where the money's coming from is sales tax is the largest piece of the pie. Those user fee charges to the enterprise utilities are 23% of the pie. So forth and so on. Where the money is coming from is where you would expect it to be coming from. Where the money goes, and again, this is citywide, the largest areas that are the largest areas that you would think of. Public safety is 22% of the pie. Public works is 10% of the pie. The water, sewer, and sanitation utilities taken together are about 27% of the pie. So again, it is those service levels that our residents, our utility customers enjoy those services directly. That's where the money is going to. You'll notice that we have $307 million coming in, $297 million going out. That is because we are budgeting for some revenues to come in from some of those general obligation bonds recorded this fiscal year and drawn down over the next 2 or 3 or 4 years. The general fund, which is the fund that we're concentrating on tonight, has a total projected budget for this coming fiscal year of $108,486,000. And again, the largest source of revenue in the general fund is sales and use tax. I know you've heard my spiel about this before, but this pie would look radically different in any city, in any state other than Oklahoma. There is no state other than Oklahoma that property tax would not be a piece of this pie. Any other state in the nation, you would see that sales and use tax piece of the pie be, 40%, 35%, something like that. And you would see a 30% or so slice of the pie where the general fund is funded by property tax. But the Oklahoma Constitution forbids cities in Oklahoma from receiving property tax for operations. So we are 2/3. We're very largely dependent on sales tax. That can be a good thing, that can be a bad thing. But the important thing is to understand that we are so dependent on sales tax. And in Norman, we're even more dependent on sales tax than most cities in Oklahoma. because we have so many of our capital funds that are also dependent on sales tax. The capital fund, the Norman Forward Fund, okay? All of those are dedicated sales taxes. The public safety sales tax fund are sales tax funds that make us even more dependent on sales tax than most cities in Oklahoma. Where the money is going to in the general fund, the police department is the largest slice of the pie. And remember now, this is just the general fund. The public safety sales tax fund, which also funds police and fire, is a separate fund from what is included in this pie. But police department is about 29%, the fire department is about 19%, the public works department is 20%. So again, those services directly to the people are the largest pieces of the pie in the general fund.
Anthony?
Yes.
So with the police budget, 29% of 108 million is 31 million for, and then on top of that,
It's public
whatever the
safety.
public safety sales tax.
Yes, sir.
And what is that number currently? We could probably get to that.
I want to say 12 million, but I'll
That's what I recall, 12. So the overall police department budget would be $43 million. Is that the way I understand it?
roughly, yeah, and we'll get the exact number for you as we move on this evening.
But worth noting always that police, fire, and public works, those just three departments are 70+% of what we do. And the personnel which we fund. So when folks ask what we're spending money on, it's mostly those three departments, but
In the general fund, and you'll see this in the budget documents, but in the general fund, about 80% of expenditures are for personnel. It's different than that in the enterprise funds. But in the general fund, about 80% of the costs are for personnel. We've been giving this sales tax picture for many years, but it has been extremely illustrative over the last year or two or three of the differences and the vagaries and the variances and the crazy juxtapositions of our sales tax and our use tax over the last 3 or 4 years. You see that going back to fiscal year 12 through fiscal year 16 or so, there was that kind of slow, steady growth that we have expected over the last 40 years. You would have seen still variances, but you would have seen variances of, up 3%, up 4%, flat. In a really bad year, it might be minus 1%. In a really good year, it might be plus 6%. Look what happened there in fiscal year 2016. We actually went down by 2.5%. Now, we know what was going on in the national economy during that time. It was a very bad time nationally, and we were reflecting that in our sales tax and in our local economy. But then we returned to that slow growth. Notice one thing, though. Look at the relationship between the blue part of this graph and the red part of this graph. The difference being sales tax versus use tax. And use tax, which is a sales tax on goods that are purchased outside of the state for use within Norman. So we're talking about here are catalog sales and internet sales. When somebody buys something online, those purchases are subject to sales tax, just like if you go down to the local store and purchase goods and services at the local store. The law is the same. But the law is very difficult to enforce as it relates to those out-of-state purchases, right? Because we don't know our individuals who go out and purchase things out of state. They're being delivered to their homes in Norman, but we don't know it, okay? Some years ago, there was a federal case where the state of South Dakota was very concerned about that sort of thing, like we all were, and they sued a major online retailer, Wayfair, and said, look, Wayfair, you're selling all of this stuff to our residents of South Dakota, but you're not paying sales tax. You're not collecting sales tax on those sales. South Dakota won that lawsuit. It went to the United States Supreme Court, South Dakota versus Wayfair. That case was a major victory for cities like Norman and all over the country in collecting use tax, because in response to that lawsuit, all of those online retailers had to start collecting use tax and remitting it to wherever they were delivering their goods and services. But there's a big old loophole in the South Dakota versus Wayfair case. Basically, Wayfair said, okay, if you sell less than $100,000 worth of goods in any given state, then you don't have to collect and remit the sales tax in the form of use tax. That big old loophole is still out there. In order to close that loophole, we need federal legislation. We're talking about interstate commerce, right? We need federal legislation to say that all retailers have to collect and remit sales tax on their purchases for delivery within those individual states. That's not happened yet. It has been before Congress. It actually passed the House of Representatives about 4 years ago. There's 2 bills that are before the Congress. One that's called the Remote Transactions Parity Act, one that's called the Marketplace Fairness Act. The Marketplace Fairness Act passed the Senate some years ago, but it never passed the House. It's never been signed by the president. And the Oklahoma delegation always votes against it, by the way. But we need that to pass. There'd be another big increase in that red part of the line if we can get one of those legislations passed.
DC agenda? Okay.
But again, the amount of collections of use tax has been growing. You had the slow and steady increase from 2017 to about 2021 in our sales tax. But what happened in fiscal year 2021?
COVID.
Calendar year 2020, yeah, COVID. Remember what happened during COVID? When the governors of every state said, we're closing down all the businesses and people stay home and all of that. That was devastating for our sales tax collections for about a 6-month period. But look what happened after that, fiscal year 22. Now, I told you that we usually, we experience 3% growth, 4% growth in a really good year. When I was working for the city of Oklahoma City during the oil boom, we had like a 7.5%, 8% year-over-year increase in sales tax. But in fiscal year 22, we had a 20% increase year-over-year in sales tax. And it's every month when I was opening up our remittance that we get from the State Tax Commission, I was like, oh my God, that can't be right, And I'm reporting all of that information to the council and the finance committee, but it was right. And there was a lot of reasons that we talked about for that big increase. But look what's happened since then, okay? Since then, we have stayed flat at that level, okay? Fiscal year 22, 23, and 24 now. Our sales tax has been flat, but it's been flat at that higher level. So we're doing okay. Use tax continues to grow at a pretty good clip, but all those things taken together, we're doing okay.
Council, just so you recognize, when we saw that big jump and the number it didn't seem real, and Mr. Francisco was on the phone with Corporation Commission saying, you guys got to recheck your numbers. Got to be something wrong here. And I think they must have received similar phone calls because they said, we're rechecking. And a week goes by and they call back and said, nope, that's right. And we honestly didn't know if that would be a one-time and then we drop back down to that 2021 level. And it kind of became the new norm. I don't think, we all probably could come up with a reason why we think it is like it is. Where's the money coming from? Did we create a whole bunch of jobs in 2022 and payroll got bigger not sure.
Yeah, I think it's all of that, and we have monitored all of that. But yes, I think payroll got bigger because, as we came out of COVID, folks did not immediately go back to work. They were making more money unemployment than they were making at work. So in order to get people to come back to work, salaries had to be increased. That drives inflation. As relates to sales tax, inflation is good. If you're buying a pair of pants that cost $30 last year and the same pair of pants cost $35 this year, we're collecting sales tax on $35 instead of $30 at 4.5 or 4 3/8%. We're collecting more money. That's what's pushing that increase, and it has stayed at that level. One of the major inputs into our sales tax performance is the performance of the building industry, the construction industry. This is one proxy for how things are going in the construction industry. We're looking at the permits that we have issued in each of these years. As you see, we had a big peak in 2021. We have declined since then, and this is where the building industry is right now. This is just looking at single family. We'll see where we go from here. We'll continue to monitor that. The folks in the planning department and Jane will continue to monitor that. We'll see where we go. But just understand that that particular input into our sales tax economy, because remember, if builders are building houses, that means they're buying shingles and they're buying lumber and they're buying bricks, and we collect sales or use tax on all of those purchases.
Yes, ma'am.
Where does multifamily?
Multifamily is not tracked here, but yes, it is tracked. The planning department can show you a similar chart like this for multifamily. But I think they tell you that the multifamily sector has been overbuilt for the last 3 or 4 years and has been sort of in a decline.
So they're slowed as well.
So,
Or they're kind of doing that decline as
Yes.
well.
This graph, kind of the culmination of economic conditions, inflation, the cost of the wood, the cost of the shingles all went up. So there are probably fewer buyers who qualify. And at the same time, interest rates are up, and that reduces the number of buyers in the marketplace as well. So where activity may be down, revenue may not be down to that same extent, but there's definitely less activity going on the builder side and on the home buyers side.
here are some assumptions that are behind the numbers in your budget document. We're projecting sales tax to grow at about 2% from where we projected to be this fiscal year. That is actually on the sort of optimistic side. As it relates to our neighboring cities in Oklahoma, most are at a 1% or a flat growth rate. We believe that taken together, sales and use tax will continue to meet those projections. We're projecting use tax to grow at about 4%. We've been above that for the last few fiscal years. Our franchise fee revenues are projected to grow at 3%. Our fines and forfeitures are projected to grow at 3% from where we've been this year. We've actually had some really good fine and forfeiture revenues in this fiscal year. We did not project any room tax or water rate increases in the current budget. Our license and revenue projections are projected to grow slowly from where we project them to be this year. We do project that 5% transfer from the water and sewer utilities to the general fund. We project a 4% transfer from the room tax fund.
Things that we're aware of that are happening late in the current fiscal year that we believe will have an impact on next fiscal year, it's just not quantifiable yet. We're looking at activity driven by the Young Family Athletic Center and its impacts on University North Park retailers and restaurateurs. We just started gathering data in March for the number of visitors and where they're coming from, how long they're staying in Norman, where they're going to afterwards. Sarah Kaplan is assembling data. What we want to do is develop metrics that will be replicatable in downtown on Campus Corner, so we can also measure impacts, the difference between a Big 12 home game and an SEC home game. Those are things that we believe will have positive impacts on our revenue picture. We don't have enough data yet to put a pin in it, what we're also recognizing is we're getting phone calls from event sponsors who are telling us, I can't find a hotel room in Norman. And I'm coming midweek in June and all the hotel rooms are booked. And I'm thinking, we check our schedule. I call Jason and is it because Young Family filled up all the hotel? Nope, we don't have a tournament that weekend, but all of our hotel rooms are occupied. And I mean, those are wonderful problems to have. We think, with our hotel staying at capacity for longer periods of time, those people tend not to drive far from their hotel. They walk around where the hotel is and spend money locally. So we'll be paying attention to it. Once the metrics are developed, we want to make a real user-friendly dashboard available to the council and the community to recognize what those opportunities look like that are coming from the Norman Forward investment in the Young Family Athletic Center and how that translates to the Sports Commission that was approved in that hotel bed tax increase. And it's an exciting time. We're optimistic. We don't have any way to really evaluate it yet, but we're building it.
And is that, even though we raise the amount, the percentage for room tax, we don't have any kind of curve to look at?
Not yet. Yeah, it'll take several months worth of hotel bed tax collections to really be able to change that graph.
Yeah, and we'll talk about that in some more detail when we get to the room tax, but this is just saying that we did not project a rate increase for the room tax, but we do project a growth beyond what we have historically projected because of that, what we're calling the SEC effect. Didn't really project much of a sales tax impact, unless you assume that I'm being overly optimistic at 2%, but we did project a growth in the room tax greater than we have historically experienced. So we'll talk about that later. On the expenditure side, you see that salary and benefits are projected at their full cost for the full fiscal year. We assume that those employees who are due for a merit increase is about 4% pay raise. Those have been built in. We had a 2-year labor agreement with the ASME and fire union, so those costs have been built into the budget. We did not have an agreement with the Fraternal Order of Police Union yet, so we did not project a cost of living adjustment for FOP. We did make 5-year projections to determine future viability and provide a base for remedial. What we're talking about there is we plug in those 5-year growth projections that if we stay on the current pace that we are on, where are we going to be? And we talked about this at the mid-year budget review. Where we are going to be if we stay on the same course is not good. We will continue to spend more than we take in, not for one-time things, but for ongoing things. And that's why we are not recommending that we add a lot of ongoing costs, like for personnel. And the city manager's budget does not propose to do that, with one exception. Salary and benefit costs are projected to grow by 5%, 1% in the maintenance and operations category, 2% in internal services. We do make the turnover savings assumption of $800,000. That is where, again, we said we budget every position at its full cost. We do that with the full knowledge that some of those positions are going to become vacant during the course of the year. And when those positions become vacant, it's going to take a period of weeks or months to fill that position. And when you fill the position, and the new person who's coming into that position will probably be at a lower rate of pay than the incumbent employee that left. Oh, but that employee that left might have had a big vacation and sick leave payout. So all of those things taken together, that $800,000 is just roughly an educated guess on the net impact of what all those comings and goings are going to have as an impact to the general fund. And it's a pretty good educated guess. Yes, sir.
So this proposed budget puts us on a path that we're not bankrupt in 5 years.
No, this projected budget would put us on a path to be bankrupt in about 8 years. But again, we've taken some remedial actions already. We would hope to continue to do that as we go forward.
What areas specifically causing us to overspend?
Well, the biggest thing, of course, is that 5% growth in personnel costs. Remember, the personnel costs are 80% of the general fund. The major revenue source is only growing at about 2%, so naturally speaking, at some point, revenues are going to be exceeded by expenditures if you stay on that course. So over the course of time, you have to maintain and hopefully arrest some of those costs. Because if you assume that the revenues are going to be fixed, you have to maintain and arrest some of those costs.
But as revenue has increased over the last few years, as you mentioned, we've also not only increased staffing, but increased salaries of existing staff.
Both of the above, yes. We both increased in fiscal year '22 the number of personnel, and we gave some pretty hefty pay raises in that year. And those things are working themselves out over time.
Thank you.
Finally, there is a general fund subsidy to the Public Safety Sales Tax Fund and the Westwood Fund to make sure that they will have a zero fund balance in those special revenue funds. There is no subsidy to the Public Transit Fund in the coming fiscal year, at least as it's projected right now. We did not project in that increase that council's talked about to the micro transit program. That's not budgeted for, but at least at this point, we projected would that be at least a break even.
Is that increase just the 68,000 that we talked about for expanding on demand to have a bigger footprint?
That could cause a subsidy,
But that's not
but that's not in here.
not in there. But that 68. So right now, transit is
Yes.
self-funded for now, unless we, which I think we did decide to go forward with doing that expansion. So, but that expansion is just the 68 roughly $1,000 we talked about for
Yes.
expanding. Okay.
Perpetually.
Yes.
And Mr. Francisco,
If we keep the program after another pilot year, I guess.
the subsidy to public safety sales tax primarily driven by debt service on the initial capital investment. That is due to mature. We'll pay off that debt instrument in 2027.
Yes.
And the current or the proposed subsidy to PSST out of the general fund is approximately how much in 25 fiscal year?
In the coming year, it's about 225,000. That will grow, however.
If I may, I would say that that subsidy in fiscal year '25 is actually due to the 4 additional SRO officers that were added in the current fiscal year, because prior to that, they were actually bringing in more revenue than they were spending.
And that's a wonderful situation when their sales tax grew due to those same inflationary factors. It improved Norman Forward, public safety sales tax, and our public transit funding formulas.
Yes, ma'am.
If we were thinking of expanding on demand, we did talk about other ways to get these things paid for. Like, if we wanted to expand over to more Norman, we could ask them if they wanted to pitch in and pay for that. I'm kind of curious, can business improvement districts pay into something like an expansion of on-demand, since Target is a place where I see the on-demand quite often in the evening? So, can bids do that?
Absolutely, and even conversations related to the business improvement district in University North Park. They collect about $200,000 a year in their bid account, and right now their primary expenditure is just maintenance projects at Legacy Park. I think they do recognize that if development grows north of Rock Creek, that they would replicate that business improvement district, potentially draw in another couple $100,000. And they have discussed the opportunity to provide, some kind of people moving service with some of those business improvement district dollars.
And I would say OU is also paying into on-demand a little bit as well.
Correct. With this expansion, it helps them achieve a need without replicating the service. for late night student transportation.
And I know that you have an agenda item, I believe, on the next council meeting related to that OU contract, but I don't know if it's covering its costs.
I was just gonna say, for business improvement districts, I don't know that they could contribute to our overall on-demand service, but the act does contemplate shuttle service within the district itself. So it would be different from on-demand, but that's something that could supplement it.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir.
I think Norman Regional still contributes 50,000 to just transit.
Right. It's a agreement for
Going to the health
air
place.
transit specifically, but yeah, transit 50,000 a year.
So yeah, there's definitely examples of partnerships we have to help get a route close to somewhere that wouldn't go otherwise. And so I had a question about the Westwood Fund though. Is it, so swimming complex, I know it's all one, but swimming complex still doing very well.
Yeah,
Is
and
it-
I'll let Jason respond to that.
Yeah, I would say that the simple fact that Westwood, Park Board disapproved me or the director doing a cost increase out there. As salaries are raising and materials have cost more, we have not had a increase at the swimming pool nor the golf course. So we were a little, since 2021, so we're a little bit upside down. We did change that, and starting July 1st, we are working or have cost increases at both the golf course and swimming pool to pay for the deficit. I think we were about 70,000 upside down last year in that fund total. And
I mean, it used to be like 200, so.
yeah, yeah, but I think the previous 2 or 3 years before that, we were even
Yeah.
as well.
Okay. Okay. What are you raising them to? I guess the base swinging.
So golf course is $3 increase to the green fees and $1 increase to the golf carts, and the swimming pool adults is going up by $2, and we're adding 20% onto all the season passes. So kids will still cost the same, and swim lessons and whatnot will still be around the same cost.
Thanks.
The police department budget, in answer to your previous question, in the public safety sales tax fund is about $10,500,000.
It's a total of 41.8 million out of that $279 million budget.
Out of the, you said 279?
The total budget across all funds.
Okay. 29% of the general fund, which was 108,
Correct.
but also 29% of the whole.
That's what.
I was just looking at the general fund sales tax pie when I did my calculation.
So this is an illustration of that employee count that we just talked about. You see the big growth in fiscal year '24 and '23, and you see the projected flat growth in fiscal year '25, and that is almost all outside of the general fund. In the fiscal year that we are currently in, we added some positions related to the implementation of the Young Family Athletic Center Fund. You'll recall that when we anticipated the YFAC operation at first, we thought we would have a third-party operator. We took over operation within the city workforce during fiscal year '24, and so we had to bring on new staff to the city, to the YFAC fund, and we did that during the course of the year that you see there. The only other positions in the special revenue funds of the city that are being added in the current fiscal year are those 4 school resource officers that we talked about, and that was by direction of council.
Yes, sir.
And the new YFAC positions though, so the YFAC is, I don't know if you call it a revenue generator.
Special revenue
But
fund.
it's an entity that does generate revenue.
Yes, there is no subsidy
So-
projected to the YFAC fund.
Okay, so like other staffing areas where we may add staffing, but it's for something we don't generate any revenue off of, so it just is.
It'll be straight out of the
So
general
this,
fund, yes.
so we can add these positions without it necessarily putting us in any.
Putting a burden on the
Right.
general fund, yeah. There's no
So-
tax money supporting that operation.
Perfect.
So the only added position in the general fund and the special revenue funds is that veterinary technician position that the finance committee recommended. That got added to the city manager's budget, but that is the only position that was added for projected in fiscal year '25. You see, though, that there were 107 positions requested. And the priority for those positions was discussed by the city manager and the management team. 53 of them were in the fire department, 2 new fire stations in particular. 32 positions in the police department. Obviously, to fund all of those positions, justified or not, there's good justification for all of those requests. But it'd be in the tens of millions of dollars to add those positions on an ongoing basis. And so while there is justification for those 107 positions, they were not added in the coming year.
We do believe it is our budget managers and department directors' responsibility to ring the bell and signal that the need for more personnel would really help achieve the mission, provide a higher level of service to our community. And it's part of the budget process. We go through those requests as a team, and but we all recognize it is most important to be able to deliver to you a balanced budget. And really, with 80% of our general fund expenses being personnel, that is the control rod that keeps us balanced throughout the year. The pace at which we fill vacancies helps control those expenditures over time, especially, we've got a lot of employees that work here for 40 years or 45 years plus. When they retire, they're, entitled to vacation accrual payout and some sick leave that they've accumulated. And it's just the pace at which we fill vacancies that really helps keep us in firm footing when it comes to books closed at the end of that fiscal year.
And that vet tech position was a part-time position, was it not?
I don't believe so.
I don't know. That's just what I remember. It doesn't mean it's true.
It was full-time.
It was full-time? Okay. Yes, sir.
So 107 new positions. So
Requested.
police, fire, and public works, those 3 combined make up 94. So the rest is the other
Other
departments?
departments, yeah, there were some in parks, there were some in,
That's
none
all
in
the
finance, by the way.
positions that all the other, is that all the positions that all the other departments requested?
Requested, yes,
But you're saying we're not filling any of those
that's correct.
proposed?
We're not proposing to.
And even if we did, we don't have 2 new fire stations.
Correct.
Yeah.
But there may be I'm sure there's other existing parts where they're needed, but same thing with 32 police or 9 public works. Are all the departments fully staffed to what we've approved so far as staffing?
We're probably down 14 in PD currently.
So we've approved X positions, but we're still full.
Yeah, we've, I would say generically, and Anthony and Kim can correct me, about 10% turnover. And I would say, Norman, I don't know how unique we are in terms of the number of very long tenured employees we have, but just through normal attrition and retirement and, family lives changing and people moving, we might have 90 to 120 vacancies a year, and we'll go through the process of recruiting and bringing them on board and training them. So there's always that vacancy, and that's that $800,000 number Anthony shows as kind of a credit to that general fund budget.
Moving on then to the Public Safety Sales Tax Fund, and this is one of the special revenue funds. All of the obligated positions to be added, and there was 90 in total, have all been made now, with those 4 additional school resource officer positions that were added during this current fiscal year. So all of the staffing additions have been made. The only critical capital need that was mentioned in the public safety sales tax ordinance that has not been done is the reconstruction of Fire Station 5. So right now, we project that we will do that when we have paid off the debt on the Emergency Communications and Operations Center and the radio system. We will build Fire Station 5 and relocate it back in more closer into town. The Emergency Operations Center is about complete. I'm not sure if the chief is here and talk about the exact date, but the dispatchers and everything will move into that facility. And
Summer of '24.
July 18th is what we plan.
when the debt is paid off on those facilities in 2027, you do not have gravy. Don't start thinking that. Okay? The public safety sales tax ordinance envisioned that happening, and it envisioned that revenues would be outstripped by expenditures. That will be the case when that debt is paid off. When that debt is paid off and all of the critical capital needs have been met, the public safety sales tax revenue will become part of the general fund. By that ordinance, 3/8% of the sales tax will go into the operating revenues in the general fund, and 1/8% will go into the capital fund. Okay? Now, I would caution you that back when the public safety sales tax 2 ordinance passed, and we had, 1/8% to replace police cars and fire trucks, we thought it was, a really nice deal. But fire trucks were costing $400,000 a year then, they're costing $1 million now. And 1/8% of capital sales tax has not grown that much. Police officers were getting paid, $70,000 then, they're getting paid $90,000 now, equipment, everything included. Those lines will still not cross. The general fund will still be subsidizing the public safety sales tax operations. It will just be within the general fund.
Yes, sir.
So if voters were to approve an addition to the public safety
Addition
sales
to the
tax
rate.
to fund building 2 new fire stations or a new police department or more staff positions in public safety, would that trigger just continue to extend out until there's not anything else added to it at some point? Or
That's an interesting question. Yes, the ordinance could be written such that what is absorbed into the general fund will be in a new public safety sales tax fund absorbed into that fund with the public safety sales tax at a higher rate than the current 1/2%. But the part of that discussion about the lines would never cross, that's speculation. Even back when this one was passed, Public Safety Sales Tax 2 was passed, we knew, we discussed publicly that 1/2% was not going to be enough going forward, that those lines were going to cross. We said, well, why don't you do 5/8%, okay? But at some point in the future, instead of it being, 2022, it might have been 2028, but the lines would still cross at some point. So I would be very reticent to say that you could have a proposed rate that the lines would never cross. As long as the rate of growth in the expenditures for those salaries for police officers and firefighters is growing faster than the revenue in the sales tax, at some point in the future, the lines are going to cross. So I would be reticent to say that, let's make it a full percent. But at some point, the lines are going to cross.
still? And, well, when we did this years ago, I never thought there would be any gravy either, because I always thought, well, after these 2 fire stations are built, 8 and 9, then we'll need to at some point build 10 and 11, and then we'll need to start replacing other ones, potentially 1 and 2 and 4 and 5,
Absolutely.
6, and or police stuff.
And just
But there
remember
would
that
never be
building
a-
the station is just one part of the
right,
problem.
staffing it.
If you add a station, that's 15 more firefighters
Right.
per station.
Right.
And that's where the lines cross.
Which is $2 million per station to staff, roughly, or something like that.
Yes.
So with Fire Station 5, when the radio system's paid off in 2027, would we issue revenue bonds to do Fire Station 5?
We
or would
could.
we try to pay it in one?
Yeah, we have talked about that.
Because then the debt,
At
the debt
this
would be
point-
extended more and more.
Yeah, at this point, we were projected, we would probably do it on a pay-as-you-go basis, but we could issue debt if you wanted to do it quicker.
Could we issue debt now if we wanted to do it quicker? Or would it be better
It
to
would
wait
have,
till that?
remember that this debt is still
So we
outstanding,
need
so
to
it
wait
would have
till
to be
that.
subordinate to that debt.
Interest rates would be high.
And if voters approved some kind of bond to do Fire Station 5, could PSST pay it back, or is there at some point, or how could that work?
Theoretically, you could write an ordinance.
So that way you're not saying voters are paying for it twice? Or
Now, when you say voters approve a GO, are you talking about?
if we just said
general
we want to get it
obligation
done
bond?
faster than 2027,
The
so we
voters could
put-
certainly authorize the revenue to
Okay.
do that, yes.
okay, thanks.
So again, this is kind of a summary of that Young Family Athletic Center revenue fund that we've talked about. It's going great guns, and I'll turn it over to Jason and his folks to talk about that in more detail. But again, it's operating about 60 hours per week, which is why those personnel are required. It's not just an 8 to 5 operation. It's not just a Monday through Friday operation. There are third-party contractors for the Norman Regional Hospital spaces and for the concession spaces that are also operational now and doing quite well. The user levels have been really good, and we'll see that will be maintained. But again, that is the job of that sports commission that was added as related to that room tax rate increase, and they're booking them in 2 and 3 and 4 years into the future. So that facility will continue to be well used. Am I leaving out anything, Jason?
We've just been really successful since we've opened getting these outside tournaments. We just completed about a month ago our first shoe tournament. It was a Puma tournament, which there was 180 teams in that, and it was spread out between Oklahoma City and Norman, with the main base being here. We also had there's a Texas basketball unit that's called the Circuit. They had their first tournament outside of Texas in Oklahoma. There was over 100 teams that participated at that. That was just at the YFAC this past weekend. We had our first, it's called Made Hoops, which is associated with Nike. They were a little skeptical, as everybody else was coming to Oklahoma, but they had 120 teams in that tournament, which is ultra successful. And we have our first live period tournament coming up in a month from this weekend, and that is a live tournament where basically it's the only time college coaches can come and be in the same area as the participants. They are saying that we'll have anywhere between 200 to 400 coaches, just college coaches, come and watch this event, and that's exclusively in Norman, and that will have about 60 teams in it. It's an Adidas live period shoe branded tournament. So I mean, we're killing it. We had our first volleyball tournament about 2 months ago, and if you do the math, you have you're just counting the kids on the court. We have 8 courts going for basketball, and there's five players, 10 players per court. Volleyball, we have 12 courts, and there's at least 6 players per team on there. We packed out. There was not a parking spot to be found over there by Embassy Suites, and I mean, this great participation right now, and the Beanstalk has been there a few weekends, and they are doing. We're happy that we got a local coffee company in there, and they're doing really well on this weekend tournament. So we just opened up at April 1st for operations, and we're up to about 100 members. So hopefully we get more on that, but we projected to have somewhere around 400 when we're all said and done. And our primary focus, even though we're trying to keep open as much as possible to the public, our primary focus will probably be these rental tournaments that come in on the weekends.
Turning now to the room tax fund, that we kind of touched on this a little bit, but our revenues in this fiscal year have been a bit below projection, and that was because we didn't have any history about what the revenues would be at this new rate. But we are projecting about an 8% growth from that projected revenue in the current fiscal year. We are very optimistic about where our room tax revenues are going to go in the new SEC environment. We have had anecdotal information from our hotel operators about their advanced bookings for football game weekends and that sort of thing, where usually they have had a 2-night minimum on football game weekends. They're going to have a 3-night minimum this coming season. Yes, they are in fact inflating their rates on football game weekends in this coming season. And it so happens that we have 6 home football weekends this year when we usually have had 5. So we do believe that there will be an SEC effect. I'm really looking forward to that Tennessee game. I got some folks coming in for that Alabama game. They did get a hotel room booked already, Daryl. But we're optimistic about our room tax revenues in the next fiscal year.
Yes, sir.
And you're just talking about how our hotel rooms are already full a lot. So if we're already full, unless we're projecting we might have more hotels go online, which maybe we do, but how do we project for more if we're already like hitting capacity without SEC games in town?
Again, it is not every day or every weekend that the hotels are full right now. And it is, I'll just say this up front, I mean, they're jacking up their rates on this coming season. And again, we're going to be collecting 8% on a higher rate than we had before. So whereas it might have been 8% on $140 a night with a 2-night minimum, now it's going to be 8% on $220 a night at a 3-night minimum. And that's the world that we are. That's the reality.
And do you think not just hotels in Norman, but in this
Absolutely,
area
there'll be
are
some
the same
spillover.
thing?
There'll be some spillover. Certainly, the Riverwind. There'll be some spillover into Moore. A lot of folks will still stay in Bricktown. So yes, there will be a spillover effect. But again, all what we're projecting is what will happen in Norman.
Those hotels are going to probably raising their rates too for that.
I can't say that. I've only talked to our hotels.
I don't want people to stay in another city because they're like, well, it's $20 cheaper to stay in this hotel in Moore than it is in Norman for this weekend. So.
There's another 84 rooms on Conference Center Drive. We hope come online this summer before the home football season begins. And there are proposals for additional hotel beds to be built in UNP. Talked to another property owner on Lindsay about bringing back a hotel on a former hotel site that's been vacant for a few years now. But there's lots of conversations because I think the market does recognize the demand is there. We're not currently meeting it locally, so all we're doing is helping Moore's economy and Oklahoma City's economy, which I'd prefer not to do.
But that also gives us an interest in that we discussed changing the room tax ordinance that we did, I can't remember when, 6 months ago or whenever that was when we raised it, to include those RVs and those kinds of spots. It's a little money, but it's something that we need to remind ourselves to do.
I remember that. Yeah.
Here are some of the other special revenue funds that are included for your reading. The CLEAT Fund is for law enforcement training, and that is both in the police and the municipal court departments. The CDBG budget is a separate budget process, but will ultimately include into the city's budget documents. The Seizures and Restitution Fund, you'll recall that last year we drew down quite a bit of money out of the Seizures and Restitution Fund balance to supplement vehicle replacements and that sort of thing. We're not budgeting to do that in this fiscal year. So the Seizures and Restitution Fund will be where it is going forward. And then as new revenues come in, council will have the discretion to appropriate those funds for whatever you may choose to do so. Again, we talked about the Public Transit Fund. The Art in Public Places Fund is ongoing. and the Westwood Park Fund we talked about, so I won't go into any more detail unless there are questions about that.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Just further clarifying, the public transit is basically half funded by the federal grant money and half funded by our locally voter-approved sales tax that was a renewal of an existing sales tax that was used to build the jail. Is that accurate?
That's correct.
Okay, just so, and thankfully this year, and I don't think the last 2 years, maybe last year, but there were 2
We
years.
did have a subsidy last year because
For
of
the
the
on-demand.
microtransit. Yeah.
So transit's been doing pretty good since revenue's been doing really well, but been self-supporting for those that wonder about public transit and who's paying for it. It being self-supported by a voter-approved sales tax and then generous federal funding from the government, so.
Taylor's also been very successful, he and his team, in securing grant funding
Yes.
for our fleet replacement. When we inherited the fleet, I think it was 22 buses in total, and there were 2 decent buses and some real rough ones. And I think at this point, we've got a very solid, reliable public transit fleet. And through a variety of grant sources, our ratepayers did not have to cover the cost of most of those
Yeah,
buses.
millions in grants, thanks to our staff, so, yeah.
Okay, so that's the end of my presentation for this evening. Going forward, and as you are reviewing your budget documents, feel free to give us a call or an email. We'll be glad to respond to your questions or anything you would like to perhaps propose as an amendment to the city manager's proposed budget. Remember that any changes to the city manager's proposed budget that entail revenues or expenditures, that entail finances, has to be done by a formal amendment that council would vote on when you adopt the budget. So we'll be working with you to prepare those amendments as we go forward. Next council meeting, there'll be that first public budget hearing. Kim and Jacob will be presenting on the capital budget documents on May the 7th, enterprise budget documents on the 21st, and then that second and mandated public budget hearing on May the 28th. We may or may not have another study session on June the 4th to talk about those amendments, or at your discretion, we might talk about them at a finance committee meeting. And then your final adoption date is set for June the 11th. And remember, there are reasons within your council meeting schedule for that date. So you can't really push it that much. You could push it perhaps a week, but you can't push it that much. By law, you have to adopt a budget.
Yes, sir.
And that is by midnight of the last day of June?
The adoption has to be 7 days before
7
the
days.
start of the fiscal year, so.
So in 2020, when we had a budget meeting and we postponed and we came back and we had such a long meeting, it was because we could
Yes.
not
When-
postpone it anymore. We had to pass a budget
Yes, sir, that's
that night
correct. You
before we could
remember,
adjourn.
you delayed it a week, and then you wanted to delay it again, and that's when that's when these gray
Right.
hairs started to go.
So in that instance, we pushed it to the absolute limit as far as the state law allows for a city to adopt a budget.
That's correct.
Yeah, we have to allow the county's review and then the filing with the state, all in advance of that beginning of the fiscal year. And of course, operationally, the ability for Anthony to run an accounts payable check run or a payroll is completely dependent on an appropriation being made with dollars behind it to make sure the checks don't bounce, so.
And that's why it's good that we have had input throughout this whole process, going back to November. I mean, there should be no big surprises on June the 11th. I've had some in my history where the council rewrote the budget on the budget adoption night, and that is chock full of errors where, you haven't properly costed out how much things are gonna cost and that sort of thing, and council adopts a budget and appropriates the money and it's wrong. That's what we don't want to happen. So please, as you're reading your budget documents, if you see errors or you see something that you want to add or take away, let us know so that we can properly cost them.
Yes, sir.
Since we talked about it in the finance committee, and for anybody in here right now that wasn't at that meeting, we talked a little bit about the grocery tax and the new state, I don't know if you call it a state law, repeal of a state law, I don't know. Does that go into effect November 1st or July 1st?
I believe it's November 1st.
Okay. And you had mentioned how complicated it may be that the state portion of the grocery tax is repealed, but not the local portion, but that a lot of businesses that sell food may not be able to.
Yes, remember that
Differentiate
the
or willing
legislation
to?
that was passed by the state is supposed to not impact on cities. What actually happened is that the state did not pass an exemption on groceries, but they rolled back the rate on groceries to zero at the state level. But our grocery sales tax will remain intact. My concern is with those retailers who at the point of sale may or may not be able to make that differentiation, okay? And so they will make the grocery sales tax zero for all of their customers and for all sorts of, municipality versus county versus state. And we won't know. We won't know. And that's the,
Yeah, 60 days before the first reports are generated, where we have access. Anthony and Kim, and they can drill down to, look at it as at an individual retailer's level. That's not public information to say, gas station X sold X dollars worth of goods and services. But it would take time before those reports are available to us. And then, those will be things we'll be looking at in great detail, as will our counterparts, around the metro. Everybody's kind of in anticipation of the same possibility. And when you boil it down to, how many retailers are there collecting and remitting sales tax in the city of Norman? It's a lot. There'll be a bunch of reports we'll be plowing through, looking for zeros where we think it should say 4 1/8.
Yeah, you mentioned that OTC may not even
yeah, they may or may not.
even be involved in enforcing or overseeing it, that we may have to.
That won't be their enforcement priority, I'll put it that way. Just know that, see, I'm not worried about the Targets and the Walmarts, the big ones, because they have very sophisticated cash registers that are already differentiating between, the food stamp sales and versus, because that's already tax exempt. But I'm worried about, Daryl gave this example of a gas station. Well, here's that Sinclair station on Main Street, that 90% of their business is gas. But they're also selling some, Lunchables and stuff like that. And they should be collecting sales tax on those Lunchable sales. And they don't have the sophisticated cash register that's gonna, 0% here, 4 1/8 there. That's what I'm worried about.
And you mentioned that if a city like Norman, if we did not collect any sales tax from groceries, it would equate to millions of dollars.
It'd be millions of dollars, yes.
And we talked about how towns like Noble, who have a single grocery store, that's their largest sales tax generator, if they didn't collect any sales tax from it, a town like Noble may be insolvent, because I think they have 2 convenience stores and 1 big grocery store, and then.
And a donut store.
And a donut store. So they don't have a lot of commerce that's generating a lot of sales tax revenue. So I know that we've talked about it, and I've heard other mayors and city officials express concern about the state saying, well, it's not going to impact cities, but as you mentioned, it could in a lot of ways. And now we're going to have to be more
More vigilant.
looking into it. And so wanted to bring that up and make sure everybody knows about that situation going on.
So
And I would like to not tax groceries if we could, honestly. I'd like to not tax groceries or personal hygiene products, but under our current, as Anthony was saying, our only state that's like this, we have no choice really, the way I see it.
In terms of council's understanding of the philosophies that went into revenue projections and our proposed expenditures. If you wake up in the middle of the night with an idea or a question about, well, why did you guys determine, the growth in, hotel bed tax is going to be X? We kind of start out with a series of assumptions and build a budget around those assumptions. So, you can change dollar amounts here and there, and that's not that big an issue. If we have a big philosophical difference in what we're seeing through our windshield, if council's seeing something different through your windshield, holler, and we'll, go through those differences together. If there are 900 city employees all participating in a process, it's not that any opinion is more valid or less valid than anybody else's. We're all just looking at a whole bunch of different windshields and trying to reach consensus by the time it comes to council for adoption.
Any further questions from council? Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Well, council, we are adjourned. And Kim, may I get a minute of your time, please?